I'm sure that our mission partners around the world are glad that churches like us partner with them. Thank God that they're willing to partner with us. What on earth do we have to teach those folks? We can learn a lot from them. Discover, develop, deploy. We're going to talk about that a bit today. A few weeks ago, I mentioned in a message that for all of us, it is important that our churches be biblical. Now, that means something different to a lot of folks, but we all desire it, right? We want to be churches that follow the scriptures. In today's message, we run into a passage that gives us a biblical model for how to make disciples, for how to raise up the next generation of leaders. And I don't think it's necessarily a how-to guide or bullet-pointed rules for making disciples, but we do see some things we can apply to our own lives. Look, we all believe in stuff. Putting that belief into practice is sometimes a little bit tricky. So find a model that you like, whether it's what you hear today, whether it's something you picked up in a small group, about 6 steps to sharing your faith. Find a model and go with it. We have to share the hope that is within us. Today, Paul gives us a model that we can use to put belief into practice. And again, it's something that we are already trying to do in this church. Here's the overview of where we're going. Paul helps people discover the gospel. Paul develops leaders. Paul then deploys leaders. Discover, develop, deploy. Bit of a lead-in into today's text. After visiting the church in Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch along with some of the leaders from the church, some representatives from the church in Jerusalem. The church in Antioch receives the essential message, the things that are going to be most important about how we're going to keep Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians in relationship with one another. The message was given and it was received. Prophecy was spoken over the church. Sounds a bit like a successful church conference. After some period of time, the Jerusalem folks head back to Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas remain in Antioch. But then we have this issue that arises over a guy named John Mark. Paul and Barnabas have a massive disagreement over him. John Mark had accompanied them on their first missionary journey, but then left unexpectedly. Paul hasn't gotten over this. Barnabas wants to invite John Mark to come back along with him on their second journey. Paul says, no, this guy's a liability. He's less than dependable, and this creates a real issue. Now, this guy, John Mark, despite the fact that he is the centerpiece of a real issue right here, a real problem, he's a pretty interesting figure in the New Testament. We don't have evidence of this in the scripture, but ancient church tradition tells us that he's probably the guy that wrote down the Gospel of Mark, that Peter gave the message and John Mark wrote it down. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter refers to a guy named Mark as his son, his spiritual son. It is likely the same guy that we're talking about here today. But after the fallout, Barnabas and John Mark head out to sea, heading towards Cyprus, retracing the steps from their first missionary journey. And Paul picks up a guy named Silas and goes in the opposite direction. I wonder if they meet someplace in the middle. After this point, it's thought that because things didn't go well between Paul and Barnabas here, some scholars believe that Paul's relationship with the church at Antioch is a bit strained from this point on. Let's dive into the text. Acts chapter 16, starting with verse 1. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. All right, a few things worth noticing here. The distance that Paul travels here is no small distance. Antioch of Syria, traveling up to Derbe and Lystra. This is a journey of a couple hundred miles through a lot of mountains. Lived in space, right? We've been talking about that a bit lately. They would have to travel through a mountain pass called the Cilicia Gate, which is still in use today as a highway. This is the most natural place to cross the mountains. So don't think a flat footpath. Think a couple of weeks on the Appalachian Trail. We encounter this guy Timothy here in verse 1. A lot of scholars believe that he was a convert from Paul's first missionary journey. This is where we see the principle discover at play. Paul helped Timothy discover the good news. So a question arises. Why has this Jewish woman married a Greek or a Gentile man? This is a bit of an issue because For Jewish folks, marrying outsiders was a problem. Many Jewish folks believed that if you married an outsider, you were inviting the wrath of God upon yourself. So why would this woman marry a Gentile man? Well, a couple of possibilities. One, they are a long way from Jerusalem. Maybe the rules are a bit more lax way out here at the edge of the world. Let's put that map picture up again. You see where Jerusalem is, clear down at the bottom, and then you see Lystra, Derbe, Iconium. This is the place we're traveling, up here in Galatia. You can see how far from the center of religious life they are. Maybe the rules are a bit laxer. Maybe there's not as many eligible marriage partners this far away from where Jewish folks would most likely be more concentrated. They are quite a distance away, several hundred miles. But it's also possible that she's just not very observant, that she didn't care about Jewish law at the time of her marriage. Whatever the reason, what do we know? She's a believer. Her son Timothy is a believer. And she's married to a non-Jewish man. Some scholars actually believe he's passed away. Her husband has passed away by this point in the story. Verse 2, the believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. So here at Lifehouse, we are in the business of trying to develop leaders. Once we find out somebody's affection for the gospel, we want to find out their reputation in the church. How are these people received by the people they go to church with? What do others think of them? If somebody wants to lead something in the church but has a poor reputation, that's going to be an issue. Paul here discovers something of Timothy's reputation. People spoke well of him. Part of Paul's mission to the world consisted of making disciples wherever he went. He made a disciple out of Timothy, and since then, Timothy had developed and maintained a good reputation in two towns, Lystra and Iconium, two towns that are about 20 miles apart. I don't even have a good reputation in my neighborhood. This is pretty impressive. Paul sees something in Timothy that makes him an ideal companion for the road ahead. Good reputation matters when it comes to sharing the gospel. You know, Timothy actually figures pretty prominently in the New Testament. I want to show you some passages from around the New Testament where reference is made to Timothy. In Romans 16:21, Paul calls Timothy his co-worker. And we'll see that in these passages over and over, that rather than lording his authority over Timothy, that he speaks of him like he's a peer. 1 Corinthians 4:17, he is Paul's beloved and faithful child in the Lord. This is one of those passages that drives us to believe that Paul did in fact help him come to know Christ. He refers to him as his child here. 1 Corinthians 16:10, he carries on the work of the Lord just like Paul did. Again, peer to peer. 2 Corinthians 1:1, Timothy is our brother. 2 Corinthians 2:19, Timothy preached Christ just like Silas and Paul did. Philippians 1:1, Paul and Timothy are fellow servants in Christ. 1 Thessalonians 1:1, Timothy is introduced alongside Paul and Silas. 1 Timothy 1:2, he is Paul's loyal child. And 2 Timothy 1:3, Paul is grateful for him. So this section of the book of Acts we're in, it doesn't really give us the full picture of how important this guy would be in the early church. But Paul really loves this guy. I think many of us will struggle with what we have made of ourselves. Have I done anything notable in life? If you can be a Timothy to somebody in a world with very few Timothys, I think you've led a successful life. Be a Timothy to somebody. Verse 3, Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So we see the principle of developing here, right? Paul helped him discover the gospel on his first missionary journey, and now we see him developing Timothy for the road ahead. And we're all on board with that principle. The practice is a little trickier. I'm not sure I would want Paul to help me practice developing in the way that he helps Timothy here. And I want to talk about this for a minute because, again, lived in space, this is kind of an important issue. I would wonder if Timothy has any questions. Paul, have you ever done this before? Do you have any certification that you can show me? Did Paul do this himself? Did he hire somebody to do it? Here's why I ask. Lived in space. Adult circumcision is described as one of the most painful things a man can go through. Not just the procedure itself, but the pain is lasting for months on end. Consider what Timothy is about to do. He's about to embark on a foot journey with Paul where they're going to walk for hours and hours a day. It's a tough time to try to recover from something like this. It's also important that we ask a few questions about why Paul has required Timothy to do this. Here, Paul insists that Timothy be circumcised, but elsewhere he says very different things. Quick aside, somebody pulled me aside after first service and they gave me permission to share this story. This individual's father became a Christian late in life, at 69 years of age. And he began to read the Bible from Genesis all the way straight through. He gets to the part where the men in Abraham's family are circumcised. And as a new believer, without having gone further in the story, he says, oh, so I'm supposed to get circumcised too. So at 69 years of age, in order to honor his relationship with God, he got circumcised. He should have kept reading. Listen to these passages. 1 Corinthians 7, 18 and 19. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? Then he should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? Then he should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Galatians 5:2, mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. If you think you have to do this to know Jesus, then you don't know Jesus. So what is Paul up to here in this moment? I think what Paul's up to is this. He's anticipating some problems that might come down the road. You will know that in the book of Acts, the same problems keep coming up over and over and over again. Who's in and who's out? How Jewish do you have to be to join up? What are the minimum requirements for admission to the church? These questions keep coming up, and circumcision is one of those things that comes up in that conversation. I think what Paul is doing is anticipating some potential issues among communities of Jewish Christians. I'm going to bump down to chapter 21 for a minute just to demonstrate that this does in fact come up again, this stuff about ceremony, ritual, and law. Chapter 21, verses 20 through 23. Paul has come back to Jerusalem. He's giving a report to the leaders in Jerusalem. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. So a rumor has gotten spread around Jerusalem that Paul is opposed to Jewish believers practicing Jewish customs. This has never been the case. What Paul has been opposed to is forcing Gentiles to practice Jewish customs. But here it looks like Paul is going to have to do something to make the peace. The best way for him to get these rumors to go away is to do something very publicly that demonstrates that he's still an observant Jew, even though he's come to know Christ. Verse 24. So here's what they tell him to do. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. It's called a Nazirite vow. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. This is how you ended this particular type of vow. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. Skip down to verse 26. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. So there's 2 things going on here. One, it was considered a good religious deed in communities of Jewish folks to pay for somebody else to end a vow. It was like an act of charity. So we'll go into more depth. Whoever preaches chapter 21, I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more. But just know this, Paul is paying for 4 guys to complete a vow. This is a bit like a feather in his cap. But the question of why Paul purifies himself is a little bit harder to answer, and there's some disagreement among scholars. In order to smooth things over, Paul goes through some sort of ritual purification for uncleanliness. And although Paul's conduct has not made him unclean, he knows this is the quickest path to peace. It will simply be easier for him to publicly complete this ritual of repentance. I got to imagine Paul's rolling his eyes in that moment, right? Guys, we've been through this 100 times. but if this is what it's going to take, I'll demonstrate to you that I want peace. Paul knows he has not taught the Jewish believers to forsake Moses, but the quickest way to quiet suspicions about his own reputation is to go through this process. So, back to Acts 16. Maybe we're beginning to figure out why Paul might require this of Timothy. I mean, consider this. You've got a guy who's got a Jewish mom and a Gentile dad. As they travel among communities of Jewish believers, questions about who this guy is and his pedigree might come up. I think what Paul is up to is this. He does not believe it's central to the faith. He simply wants to avoid getting bogged down in issues related to ceremony and ritual. This will likely give them quicker inroads into communities of Jewish Christians. And that's how Paul rolls. Every time he goes to a new community, where does he go first? He goes to Jewish folks first. So they're going to be running in to folks for whom this might matter. This is a quick way to avoid a very repetitive conversation. So another question about Timothy. I wonder why he hadn't been circumcised already. My best guess is that his Gentile father forbade it, but now Paul is insisting on it. Perhaps you've heard of the principle of matrilineal descent. There's some questions here about, is Timothy Jewish or is he not? And maybe you've heard of this thing called matrilineal descent. It's this idea that your Jewishness is passed down to you through your mom. If you've ever known somebody that has done a birthright trip back to Israel to consider becoming an Israeli citizen, they are able to demonstrate that they have Jewish heritage on their mom's side of the family. So, this came into practice sometime between the year 10 and 70 AD. Our story we're reading today is between 51 to 53 AD. So a couple possibilities. One, the practice hadn't started yet, or two, because they're so far away from Jerusalem where the practice was likely started, maybe it just hasn't trickled out to these far away parts of the world yet. But this matrilineal descent thing is interesting. Why did this become a thing in the first place? Well, when you look to modern communities of Orthodox Jews, many believe that it has something to do with the nature of the soul. I don't know if that means that the soul is somehow feminine, but it has something to do with the metaphysical concept of the soul. They also believe, in many Orthodox communities in our own time, that matrilineal descent was an oral law given at Mount Sinai. All these things that Moses wrote down, that there were many verbal things that were given. That's a tradition in some Orthodox communities today. All of these oral traditions in Judaism would eventually be written down by mid to late 2nd century in a kind of a big Jewish commentary called the Mishnah. But at the time of our story, it appears as though this oral tradition was not in play. One more thought, a bit of a side note on matrilineal descent. Can you imagine what would have happened to Judaism over the last 2,000 years if descent had not been passed down through the moms? Consider the persecution of Jews, not just in the 20th century, but throughout basically every empire in the Western world. Jews have always been persecuted. Consider how many Jewish men have been murdered and how many Jewish women have been violated in ways that resulted in childbirth. Matrilineal descent might very well have helped preserve Judaism down through the centuries. Okay, so back to our text. Timothy gets circumcised to help avoid some repetitive conversations. Paul is developing him for the road ahead. Verse 4, as they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So what do we see here? Deploy, right? They're out doing the thing now. This is the next step once you've been developed. They go town to town, passing on the message of unity from the church in Jerusalem. You remember those 4 things that they're going to be unified on from chapter 15? No meat polluted by idols, no sexual immorality, no meat from strangled animals, and no blood. These 4 basic requirements will keep Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in relationship with one another. Verse 5, so the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. So they go town to town, passing on the message from the leaders. The existing churches did 2 things here in verse 5. 1, they were strengthened in their faith, growing in wisdom. But new believers are being added to their numbers all the time. In our own time, it generally seems that churches are either one or the other, right? We all know of very small churches where the people are wise, where they have a depth of biblical knowledge that is impressive in many cases, but haven't seen a single convert in years. We also know of giant churches where they're always adding converts, but the people don't know much about the scriptures, and in some cases don't seem too interested. What we need under the same roof is both. We need wise people, and we need to be adding numbers. Quick side story. A buddy of mine is a member of a major denomination. He's a pastor. And every year they have their national conference. And a discussion point came up that needed a vote at the national level. It was about the future of local mission and evangelism in this denomination. And my buddy stood up and he said, yeah, a point of order, Mr. Chairman. In my home district, 2/3 of the churches have not seen a single convert in the last year. I'd like to make a motion that none of those churches get to vote on evangelism and mission since none of those churches are doing it. Of course, this motion was not received very well. Funny story, but we get the point, don't we? There's this thing that happens over time where we become a holy huddle. And we forget that one of the primary reasons we exist is for people that are not yet a part of the church. We need to remember that. But we also know that there are giant churches in the world full of believers that lack wisdom. We need both. We need churches that are not just a mile wide, but a mile deep. And we see that demonstrated in verse 5. So quick review of where we've been today. 1, Paul helps people discover the gospel. He helped Timothy discover it on his first missionary journey. 2, Paul develops leaders. He developed Timothy for the road ahead. Paul then deploys leaders. He stands shoulder to shoulder with people on mission. So discover, develop, deploy. This is what we're about here. Over and over and over again, as long as God gives us breath. May it be true in this place. Amen.